IPMNation.com.
Living in a city, when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are felt, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never wanna be a New Yorker.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, depending on what time you're listening to this show. You've reached Dr. John Rich, and this is Dr. John's Neighborhood. So normally I start the show with somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes of talking about some kind of psychological topic that's on my mind or is connected to something that I'm in the middle of writing. Today I have the pleasure to have a conversation with Miss Anna Seewald, who is a parent counselor. And since she has a podcast and I have this radio show, we decided that instead of me interviewing her or her interviewing me, that we would just have a conversation. And we pre-recorded that conversation, and it turns out that we talked for just shy of an hour. I think that you'll find it very meaningful. I know that I did. I share some of my personal story. She shares some of her personal story. And along the way, we talk about some important issues in terms of how to raise children using positive parenting tactics. This is all connected to an online conference that she and I are going to be participating in. In fact, this interview is going to be part of that online conference. It's called the No-Spank Challenge. Miss Seewald and I are dedicated to the idea that spanking should be removed from the arsenal of tools that parents use to discipline their children. And in fact, Miss Seewald is going to make the very interesting and provocative claim that parents shouldn't even use any punishments. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. We're just going to take a few second pause, and then you're going to hear the conversation begin. I will talk to you next week. I hope you enjoy the conversation. By the way, if you ever have any comments or questions or things that you would like to say in response, feel free to email me at info@drjohnrich.com. Thanks for tuning in. Talk to you soon.
IPMNation.com.
Hi, John.
Hi, Anna. I'm excited about this conversation we're about to have.
Me too. We are here together because something unites us, something brings us together, an exciting project, an initiative that we're part of. Would you like to share what it is?
Yeah, that'd be fine. So we met as a result of Amy Bryant and something that she's doing, which is called the No-Spank Challenge. And basically it's bringing together all sorts of people who care about parenting and write about parenting and counsel people about parenting, trying to encourage those parents to use positive parenting practices and particularly to avoid spanking, it's time for spanking to be taken out of the arsenal of the tools that parents find permissible to use. If you're interested in it, by the way, you can find information about it at parentingbeyondpunishment.com.
Yes, she has been doing this challenge for a few years now. I have been supporting her, and I'm excited to be part of it. And I'm looking forward to our conversation about discipline, punishment, no spanking, and everything in between. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself? What do you do? What your interests are professionally? And we'll get started from there.
Okay, great. So my name is Dr. John Rich. I'm a professor of psychology at Delaware State University. I have a degree in educational psychology, and you can imagine that when you're studying about education, there have to be courses that are also about parenting, because a lot of the things that students do when they're in the school reflect how they were parented and the situation that they find themselves in when they're at home. I have been published a lot in academic work over the years, but there was a certain point where I started to feel like my academic writing was basically just me writing academic stuff for other academics so that those academics could criticize what I had said. And I really felt like, I feel like the research that's out there that I have access to about effective parenting practices is something that can benefit almost anybody. So what I decided was that, first of all, I wanted to finally write a book about parenting, and that book is going to be coming out in May. And I also decided that I wanted to create a website where I would just write about that research. So the goal that I had in mind and what I'm trying to do is to take the most recent research about effective parenting, and then I translate that research so that people who don't have PhDs and don't know what the big words mean can still benefit from what psychologists know about how parenting can impact kids and how positive parenting in particular can raise kids to be strong and secure. How about you? Can you tell us about yourself?
Yes, I love what you shared, and it aligns with what my mission is. So I am a psychologist and an educator. I worked mostly with children for nearly 18 years. And then for the past 9 years or so, I started working with parents because when I became a mom, I realized that it's parents who need a lot of help and support. And in order to help children, I can help parents. So that became my mission. And I opened a private practice soon after in New Jersey, where I live. And I work with parents from around the world. I see people in my private practice, but I also work with people over Skype and phone. And it's pretty a remarkable, humbling, and enriching experience. I also teach court-ordered parenting classes, which I have developed the curriculum. I also teach at the homeless shelter parenting classes. So I work with a large group of parents from all walks of life, and I see the challenges, the stories, and the struggles that we all share. And parenting, what unites us. So I'm very passionate about the subject of parenting and discipline in particular. But I would love to ask you, what do you mean by positive parenting? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? I think that would be a good place to begin.
Yeah, that'd be good. So a recent article that I summarized was about attachment theory. And one of the things that researchers like to talk about in terms of attachment theory is the degree to which a parent is sensitive to their child and also responsive. So by sensitive, what they mean is that when the child is sending signals, like they're upset or they're uncomfortable, or maybe they'd like to switch activities, or whatever signal they might be sending, that the parent is paying attention and in tune with what those signals are. And then in turn, the parent is responsive to those signals and is trying to be empathetic and provide the child with what it is they need. So by positive parenting, we're really talking about, in a pithy sort of way, just treating children like they're people, because they are, and almost like the golden rule, treating your child the way you would want other people to treat you. And in particular, I'm adamant that spanking, in my opinion, is not only unethical, but from the research standpoint, it's not even all that effective, especially in the long term.
Yes, I agree. Maybe then we can speak about spanking. And sometimes jokingly, I say, well, not jokingly, that we don't really need research to tell us that hitting, hurting another human being, especially a little child, for the purposes of quote unquote education or discipline, we don't need research for that. We need common sense, right?
Yeah. And, another thing that I tell my students is that even if I can't convince you that spanking doesn't work because you grew up and your parents spanked you and you feel like you turned out okay, if I could at least convince you that using other ways of interacting with your child can be just as effective as spanking. If I can't even convince you that spanking is ineffective, but I can convince you that there are other things that you can do that will be just as effective, doesn't it sound better to not hit your kid?
Yes. Well, but we live in a world where spanking is unfortunately legal, not only in 19 states of the United States, but also in different countries. Yes, it's banned in many countries and it's very remarkable and we need to support that. But somehow with the research that we know from the 60 years or more so, this no spanking hasn't been implemented successfully, like once and for all. It's taking such a long time. I don't know if you agree with that, you don't disagree. I would love to know your thoughts.
That it's taking a long time? Yeah,
Yes.
I kind of feel like there's something going on in American society that's making this issue be front and center. When I go on social media, I see people talking about it and arguing about it all the time. And it's my opinion as a psychologist that if there's an issue that the society doesn't feel is even on its radar, then nobody's talking about it. It's only those issues where people are struggling to try to come to terms with something that has happened that you begin to see these conversations arise. So, for example, when Bruce Jenner decided to say that he was transgendered and he became Caitlyn Jenner, I'm not sure what the language is for describing that. So if anyone's offended at how I just said that, I apologize. All of a sudden, you started seeing jokes about transgenders and conversations about transgendered people and historical views of what transgendered means. And that hadn't been in the conversation before that really all that much. Same thing with spanking. I feel like we're on the verge of this tipping one way or the other. And I feel like the No-Spank challenge is a really important event in the life of our country in particular that could maybe push it in the right direction.
Yes, I agree. We live in exciting times. I totally agree. And especially with social media, things get widespread and people have access to information and conversations like the one we're creating and putting into the ether. I think it all begins with having that conversation, inviting the other party to the table to have an open, welcoming conversation. It is not by arguments or fights or saying, you're wrong, this is my way, let's stop this. I am supportive of a peaceful way of influencing people because we're speaking about punishment. We cannot exert our force, our quote unquote position to reinforce other people to change their ideas and opinions. And by doing so, we're rejecting their entire being because people who support spanking, they were spanked once. And who are these people? They are people who carry tremendous amount of trauma. The people I work with who are engaged with the criminal justice system, who are homeless, who are drug addicts, people who say, I was spanked and I turned out okay. That hurts me deeply. But I want to invite them to a conversation, and we do need to do that ever so gently so that they're not frightened. Because if I grew up with spanking and harshness, it's hard for me to hear that it was wrong. You know what I mean? So I am going to defend my reality. And it becomes a very personal battle. So where I stand as a professional is education, raising awareness. After that, giving them time to process, open conversation, and then change will happen slowly, but it will.
Right. I've heard that before too, where people say, well, I was spanked when I was a kid and I turned out okay. And for some people, I think it would feel like a betrayal of their parents if they were to say that the way that they had disciplined them all throughout their childhood turned out to be wrong. I just kind of feel like there's nobody out there that's going to say that their parents were perfect. And so it's up to us as parents, I feel, to think soberly and objectively about how our parents were with us, and then make decisions to keep their best practices and improve upon the practices that we wish they had done differently.
Absolutely. And it is not about blaming parents, today's parents or the parents of their parents, yesterday's parents. It is not about shame, guilt, blame. I completely disagree with that kind of approach, because I want to understand what made that person hit their child, spank their child. My grandfather, for example, my grandmother would say, oh my gosh, your grandfather was a brutal man. The moment he walked in, all 5 kids, my father and his siblings would just be quiet and pretend everything was, normal, quiet. They would just disengage from their cheerful, lively games because he had temper. And I remember my grandmother specifically told this story that he one day was so angry and rageful, came home from work. She put out food on the table, and there was not much of a food. She made some kind of pumpkin soup, I believe. And he was so mad because the children broke the light in the house or something of that nature. He put his fist into the hot soup and it splattered all over the newly laundered white bed sheets. And my grandmother used to tell that story, and she would say that he was a harsh man. He was a harsh man. And I imagine how my father and his siblings survived and grew up in that environment.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to a question that I wanted to ask you, which was, obviously you have a strong opinion, as do I, about how to best teach our children as they grow older. But where did that come from for you? Did that come as a result of the counseling that you did? Is that how you became convinced that spanking was something we should avoid, or did you come to that conclusion earlier?
Very good question. Let me reflect on it on air, openly, honestly, for the first time out loud. I have never spoken about this. No one has ever asked me about this, actually.
Oh. Are you okay?
Yes,
Sure.
I
Okay.
am very okay. So I grew up in a very loving home. My parents never, ever spanked me. My parents were teachers, and I grew up in a household of extended family where everybody was a teacher. So at least my relatives, my aunts, uncles, and their wives and husbands, everybody in my family was involved in education. So there was no spanking. My childhood was excellent. I'm not saying there was no blaming or shaming or guilt tripping. My parents would manipulate me to do things, to ask me or get me do things. Yes, but I was never hit or spanked physically as a child. I grew up in the Soviet Union, however, when there was a lot of harshness. And growing up, hearing those kind of stories from my grandmother, not only my grandmother, but also people. I love stories. I love old people. I love people in general. So I grew up in a society which was oppressed for many years. So I heard a lot of stories growing up. I had witnessed families in my neighborhood. A particular family in my building, husband was alcoholic, mother was always crying and seeking help from the other neighbors. My mom would help this poor woman. I was friendly with their children, and my friend would say, I wish your parents were my parents. She would always tell that to me. And I would wonder why, like, she has her own parents. Like, why would she want my own parents? As I grew up, I understood what she meant because there was a lot of violence and abuse in her home. I grew up in a society where I witnessed a lot of violence, and going to school in the Soviet Union was no joke. There was a lot of quote unquote discipline, harshness. I was never spanked in a school. I don't seem to recall that anybody was spanked physically, corporal punishment in the school, but there was a lot of moral judgment and shaming and strictness where there was a lot of abuse, but not physical abuse happening. So I grew up in that kind of society. And as an observant kid, I took it all in. Then my life took a turn when I was 13. A severe earthquake happened, and I lost my mother in the earthquake, my home, my classmates, everything. We were relocated, and, my life was turned upside down. It was then that I was left on my own, basically to grieve and be with my own feelings. And I did a lot of thinking on my own and reflecting. And in that summer, I was sent to Moscow, Russia, for evacuation purposes, and I met a group of orphans for the first time in my life. And when I became friendly with them, I realized that they're missing something. There was no emotional resonance. Our friendship wasn't blooming. It affected me deeply. And I came back and I said, I want to become a psychologist. I want to help children, and I want to work with orphans. So I did, many years later, become a psychologist, did work with orphans and street children and beggars. And I worked in a correctional facility for juvenile delinquents, which was another phase of my life as a young person in my 20s. I was thrown into this harsh environment where children were being literally abused physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically every single day. And I changed that. And based on what I did, I got a scholarship to come to the United States as a leader, as a change maker, and all of that. But in that facility, I was shaped as a human being that harshness, punishment is not a way of treating people. And fast forward many years, today I work with criminals who are forced or ordered by the court to take parenting classes. And I know the deep trauma that people carry that leads them to drug addiction, to crime, and to other stuff. So that's where I come from and how my views were shaped. And when I became a parent, of course, it was very natural that I would never hit or spank my child. In fact, my daughter is turning 10 and she has never been punished in a traditional sense of the word. And maybe we can talk about what punishment is, what forms of punishments are there. And she was never even put a single time in a timeout. And she's an amazing kid. So take it away, John. Now it's your turn. How about you?
Well, I'm perfectly willing to share my side, but I feel like, so in the research about parenting and how people say, well, this is how my parents did it, so that's how I'm going to do it. The term for this is called intergenerational transmission of parenting. So intergenerational, across the generations, and then transmission means that it's like communicated or replicated, and that the majority of people parent their own children the way they themselves were parented. So not to take anything away from you, because you've done a great job with your daughter, but like you said, it was perfectly natural for you to raise her without using spanking because that's what your parents modeled for you. The comment that I want to make is it sounds to me like your own parents were fairly radical in their non-use of spanking and gave you quite a gift and your daughter quite a gift.
Thank you for saying that. I think they did. I never gave them credit for that. Yes, my father is very radical. He influenced me significantly. My mother is not alive, as I said, but my father, yes, because of the ways he was raised. And his childhood was miserable, the way he talks about the harshness that he grew up. And my grandfather forced him to do a lot of physical labor and, a lot of stuff. So my father is a very soft man. He's a writer. He's a poet. And he raised us with completely different philosophy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so that's great, because now your daughter, when she gets to be a parent, she's likely to raise her child in a more positive fashion. And so some of the things that I've written about, I say, well, yeah, so you may have been raised and your parents spanked you or used certain forms of harsh discipline. You feel like you turned out okay. Congratulations. But who's to say that you couldn't have turned out even more okay if things have been done differently? So pass that on to your own children. Do a better job, whatever that means for you. Try to figure out what kinds of things you could do to improve upon their legacy so that the next generation gets to benefit from your courage.
Yes, yes. And, what do they mean when they say I turned out okay? People who say that, they usually have depression, anxiety, chronic diseases, or underlying other issues, well-being or health related, and we know the direct link today scientifically what can contribute to that. Growing up in a harsh environment, being threatened all the time, being fearful of the very same people who are supposed to protect and love you, who you are attached to, who are your parents. They also sometimes spank you and sometimes mistreat you. And so you grew up in this ambivalent environment, and that affects your sense of self. That's a trauma in and of itself. We can maybe talk about how spanking is wrong, if you would like to elaborate more, or should we bust some myths about this subject? On a separate note, when I went for the first time to the homeless shelter to teach parenting classes, I asked them what subjects would they be interested in learning. I was trying to get to know my audience. The first thing they said, anger management, and please teach us about discipline. And what discipline means is punishment, right? Because people use those two words interchangeably. And one of the men said, in fact, my mom spanked me and I deserved it. So what can we say about that? What would you like to say when somebody says, I was spanked, but I deserved it?
Well, yeah, I mean,
that's heavy.
That's like blaming the victim, really. I mean, it's hard to comment on that, really, because I come from a place where I feel like spanking is an act of violence. And I'm actually a Quaker. I don't know if you know about the Quaker religion, but the Quaker religion is a peace-based religion. And so we're against all forms of violence. So for somebody to say that they deserved to have an act of violence brought upon them is hard to argue. I definitely hear from my students that they were spanked and they felt like it was effective. But then when I talk to them about what we mean by effective, I think that most people understand what I'm talking about. So basically what I tell my students is that the research on punishments, especially spanking, is that the parent can get the child through those techniques to stop doing the behavior that they're being punished for right now in the short term. But when they're tempted to do the behavior again, they haven't learned the overarching lesson about why a person should act in a certain way and not act in another way, or why a person should express extreme emotions in appropriate ways as opposed to violent ways. They haven't learned that lesson. They haven't internalized the lesson. What they're likely to do the next time they want to commit the same behavior is to think about, what did I do last time that got me caught, so that this time when I do it, I can make sure that I don't get caught. And so going back to what these prisoners said, it seems like people understand that part of parenting is to help correct behavioral issues that their children might have. For example, when they get frustrated, they may be inclined to hit somebody or scream or say something that's inappropriate. But it's also another element to it, which is to teach children how to be courageous and self-assured and confident. So it's not just stopping the negative stuff, it's also encouraging the positive stuff.
Yes, and when parents use any form of punishment, which punishment we can define, I don't know what you call punishment, but this is how I define punishment, is when someone bigger, stronger, more authoritative, who has power, uses pain or fear to inflict unpleasantness, to teach you a lesson, quote unquote, to deter you from doing the thing you're doing, or to make you do the thing that they want you to do. It's a form of manipulation and control, and it's bullying, to tell you the truth. That's the definition of bullying. And of course, fear is a big motivator. There is no doubt about that. Fear is a great motivator. It can stop you in your tracks and make you do the quote unquote right thing. But here is the question. Do we want to raise our children in an atmosphere of fear or in an atmosphere of love and respect? Because what are they learning when we are inflicting this kind of pain, unpleasantness, using our power and size to quote unquote teach a lesson? They are learning a lesson from us, because we know that children learn from modeling, right? 70% of 85% of behavior is learned. They're learning to do the same, to use their power and their authority and their size and bully little Johnny in the playground, bully Mary in school. And that's why we see the numbers in violence, bullying, anxiety, depression are rising in our society. And it comes down to ineffective parenting. Not only, I don't want to blame parents for that, but it's the trauma that we all carry from our past that hurts us to be open to new ways of parenting, because many parents are so conditioned the way they were raised, right? So they continue the same cycle. And when you are traumatized, your sense of self is distorted. You're disconnected from your own sense of self. So you see nothing wrong with that. That's your own reality. And that's what's painful about this whole thing.
So you've kind of intimated this, and let's just jump into this conversation, because one of the things that we talked about before the show was that you're somebody, you don't advocate punishment in any form. And I have a feeling that the fact that I feel like children sometimes need to experience consequences for behavior. I feel like those consequences need to be delivered in a loving way. But for example, I did use timeouts with my children, and I don't consider that violent. I consider that to have been pulling my child out of a situation that had become toxic. For example, another kid and he throwing things at one another, and putting my child in another place to try to calm the emotions down so that I could then sit and we could have a conversation. So go ahead.
That is not, I wouldn't consider that a punishment per se, what you just described. It all depends how we define those things, right? What does timeout mean?
So when I was, I'll just interrupt real quick, because when I was thinking about this coming into the show, I've latched onto this word punishment to describe some of the things that I've talked about on my website. But in thinking about it, I'm not sure that when you're saying you're against punishment and I'm saying that I see a need for punishment at times, that maybe we're just talking about similar things but using different terms. So let's say that your daughter, when she was 5 years old, picked up a toy and threw it at another child and hit that child in the face. Mm-hmm. Some thoughts about what would you say to a parent, or what would you do in that situation to try to, first of all, de-escalate the situation, and secondly, try to help your daughter see that might not be the best way to express whatever she was feeling?
Yes, that's a perfectly good example. I definitely wouldn't put her in a timeout. I wouldn't put her in a corner or sit her on some chair and say, this was not nice. This was wrong. You got to sit here for 5 minutes because you're 5 years old. That's what the common knowledge is, right? People hand out timeouts based on the age of the child. And until you think what you did is wrong, blah, blah, blah. I would never do that, knowing what I know about neuroscience, brain development, and child development, and all of this stuff. And I can explain. In that situation, if my child threw the toy and it hit some kid and that child is crying, if the mother is there, I would apologize to that mother, and I would make sure that child is okay. And, I would glance and see what's happening, because I want to be responsible too if something major happened. But if it was one of those kiddie moments when, let's say that child wasn't hurt, there is no blood gushing or something like that. It's just a typical thing. So I would pick my child up, remove a little bit, go maybe to the corner, or I don't know, sit somewhere if we're in a playground. I would try to not talk in that moment, and I can explain why I do all of those things. First, I would attend to myself. This is the first step. In that moment, of course, any parent would try to be reactive because someone's kid is hurt. And if my kid was on the receiving end, that would trigger my stress response. I would do everything in my power to remain calm and not lose my temper and not get angry at my own child in that moment, because I know that when I get dysregulated, I fly off the handle and become dysregulated in that moment. It's not going to help my child, because my child, first of all, why did she do that in that moment, right? Children just don't do naughty things. We want to understand what drives their behavior. We can speak about that after I go through the steps. So
sure.
I would try to regulate myself. There are things I say to myself in those moments, such as I'm trying to help my child. There's a self-compassion piece, or breathing techniques that I recommend people do. That there are things involved to regulate myself. And it doesn't take long. It takes a couple of seconds. And then I would sit by my child. It depends if my child is angry or crying significantly, I would try to have a compassionate look on my face, because that really helps. I would connect to her on that level emotionally. I wouldn't say many words, because words in that moment don't register. We know from brain science that if my child is dysregulated, she's not going to hear anything. It's going to be too much noise, and that's going to contribute to her dysregulated state. I would just sit next to her, maybe put my hand on her back, hold her safely. I will have a compassionate look on my face that matches the intensity of her own emotion in that moment, because my child is feeling probably horrible too inside, because she knows that child is crying. She's 5. She saw the result, what has happened. I'm not going to moralize her in that moment. So my support, my emotional support, is vital in that moment for her to get regulated, because when she's dysregulated, she's not ready to listen, learn, pay attention, and things going to get exacerbated. That's my first order of things, to stay calm and regulated myself, not to appear a source of threat or fearful in that moment, that I'm here to get you, how dare you did that, or that was not right. And I'm going to use very few words, because her brain is not ready to perceive anything. But I'm going to sit next to her, look at her compassionately, put my hand, have her cry or go through her emotional process, which will be 10 minutes, 15, 20, I don't know, depends on the severity of the case. And then I want to communicate that she's safe here, that she has an ally, that I'm on her side. I'm not going to blame, shame, and guilt her for doing something quote unquote bad. We all make mistakes, and my goal is not to correct the mistake that she already did, but my goal is with this approach to prevent future incidents similar of happening, because what happened now is happened. I'm sorry. We can't correct that. I can't break my child with words and hurting and punishment to fix something that just happened. So accept the reality, what is, but try to discipline later for preventing future incidents. And when we do this co-regulation together, then she would be able to listen and understand and probably feel remorse, and we can make things better and talk about that if need be, whatever the thing is in that moment, and then move on. Is also another wonderful tip, I would say, is you don't want to linger and ruminate and make a big deal out of something that is, you don't want your child to be hyper-focused on their behavior, that I'm a bad kid, that I did this. I also want to reframe using phrases like, that wasn't nice, whatever, because that's a judgment call. I would bring my child's attention to the other child's feelings when my child is ready to perceive new information, to evoke some empathy in her, but I wouldn't judge her for doing that and things of that nature. And maybe later in the evening, we can have a conversation. Remember when you threw the toy at Melanie? Did you look at her face? Yes. Was Melanie upset? Yes. How come, honey? Melanie was upset, Mommy. It hurt her. Yes, that's right, sweetheart. What can you do next time? So you can talk about that later in the day too, to loop that whole process. That's what I would do. Sorry for a long-winded answer. But.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I'm just busy thinking to myself, like, where do I align with you? Because again, when we talked before, I think one of the things that I really liked about our conversation was that I felt like, in spite of some of the different techniques that we might use, that we're both on the same side, and we both have a lot of things that we agree on. Mm-hmm. So what I heard you saying that I have no problem with and think is fantastic is that, first of all, if a parent is upset, that's not the time to enact any kind of consequences or even much conversation, because you're going to be less able to control yourself, both verbally and behaviorally. So that's one thing that I heard that I think is really good. Secondly, I think that what we're teaching our children in moments like these is, first of all, at some point, empathy for the other person, which you definitely emphasized, and also being able to think about alternatives to behaviors. So when I said before that when you spank, all you learn is that you did something bad, and what you didn't learn is what the overall lesson is, so that you're convinced that you should do something differently. And one of the reasons you don't learn that lesson is because most punishment, not just spanking, but most punishment doesn't come with any kind of conversation or information about how to handle that situation the next time. So if the reason that your daughter threw the toy at the other girl is because the other girl did something to frustrate her, this is a great opportunity for there to be some reflection between the parent and the child about how can you handle frustration differently the next time you're frustrated. Maybe the parent can share sometimes when he's been frustrated or she's been frustrated and how we handle that. Because the truth is that when your daughter grows up and gets a job, she's going to have a boss who's going to frustrate her, and she's not allowed to throw anything at the boss. So that's one thing that's for sure. So I heard a lot of great lessons there.
But the key is also to remember their age and their development, right? I can tell you that, I mean, we don't have a lot of time today to go in detail. I am writing a book actually about the 4-step calm formula that I have created. It's for the parents who want to remain calm and composed in the moment, because that's the key. That breaks the deal, that in the moment, that's what's important, how you remain calm and composed so that you can address your child's behavior, frustration, temper tantrum. The key is not to get hijacked yourself emotionally. And chances are we are going to. We're a human being. We have a nervous system and all that. But there are things we can do to make it less our reactions or not be reactive at all and things of that nature. The second thing I would say is that when we raise children with emotional awareness and we listen to their feelings, we're not permissive parenting them. My daughter has never hurt another human being, another child. She has a lot of empathy and resilience because I did listen to her feelings and I did do the teaching and the discipline and I do set limits. I do say no to my child. It's not like she gets a free rein with everything. Oh, trust me. She will tell you, Mom, you're so mean. But I do know that I do have to set limits, but I never hurt her. Physically, I've never hit her. I never put her in punishment. I never imposed any artificial consequences of any sorts. She would even laugh at me if I said, you didn't do your homework, no screen time for tonight. We can talk about artificial consequences like that, perhaps. But when we raise children with this awareness about emotions and development and how the nervous system works, regulation, dysregulation, co-regulation, children actually do learn to handle their frustrations a lot better. And I can tell from my experience, when I observe my child in comparison to other children of her age, how they handle the same situation, it's remarkable how my daughter bounces back, how challenges are not challenges for her. She has this excitement of tackling and she knows how to manage her emotions. I gave her those tools early on. But the key is we need to co-regulate with them from an early age so that they can develop the self-regulation skills on their own. That's the key part. I didn't leave her. If I put her in timeout in that moment, I said, you misbehaved, go in the corner and sit down and think what you did wrong, and then we can talk or whatever, then I'm not co-regulating with her. She's left on her own with her primitive brain, underdeveloped brain. She doesn't have the tools. She needs a caregiver, an attuned caregiver to walk her through the process so that she can see that, oh, things end, frustrations end. I had this experience and now I have a new perspective and I learned something as a result. So they become more resilient. That's my point.
Yeah. And I say in my own fathering, as my children have gotten older, they're 13 and 14 now, I've definitely shifted from those artificial consequences more to conversations where I'm trying to help my child see how the behavior was being perceived or how they might have handled things differently. And those conversations seem to be pretty effective. So I forget, I had another point. We're talking about so many great things that
I know.
I'm thinking about them while you're talking, and then you make another brilliant point, and then I lose the first comment that I wanted to make. But I do like the idea of the parent learning strategies for calming themselves down, because I know from the psychological research that the modeling that we see is far more effective in shaping our behavior as children than what our parents say.
Yes.
So being calm is essential. And we didn't get much of a chance for me to talk about my story, but I'll do it very quickly in order to make this point. So both of my parents came from pretty abusive households. My mother was beaten by her father pretty regular basis, along with her older brother. My father was raised by an alcoholic father who was a police officer, And he had a couple favorite punishments that he liked to use on my father. The one was to burn him with lit cigarettes. And then there were a couple occasions where he, I guess, thought it would be helpful to make him sit while he put his mother in a chair, and then he pulled a gun to his mother's head and pulled the trigger. And there were no bullets in the gun, but still, like, he said that he did that at least 3 times that he can remember.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So back to the point about parents being regulated, I know from the research that when I did something, my father's first instinct, I can almost guarantee it, was going to be abusive.
Yes.
That's got to be what crosses his mind especially when he's feeling frustrated. And so even though I was brought up in a household where I was spanked occasionally, I don't know how many times total, maybe a dozen times, something like that, I also have a consciousness of both my mother and my father counting while they were spanking and holding back. I'm sure they were holding back. I'm not trying to excuse the spanking. I'm against spanking. I want to make sure that that's clear. But the gift that they gave to me was to be courageous enough to not do it exactly the same way. So I'm not sure that they were capable of completely getting rid of it, but they had to have some kind of self-control in that moment to not really wail on us. And that experience that I had where they scaled it back, I think put me in place to really think about it and to get rid of the practice altogether.
Wow. Oh my gosh. This breaks my heart when I hear stories like this, when you say that they were scaling it down because that's all they could do. You know, people who carried a tremendous trauma.
Yeah.
That's how they could manage. That was their internal resources. That's all they had. Unfortunately, love is not enough to be a parent. And I can tell you, I work with parents from all walks of life. And I have never, ever met a parent who doesn't love their child. But love is not enough. But what hurts parents the most is that trauma, that what you describe about your father's situation. It's hard, and he didn't get help. And forget the modeling part, the help that he needed to heal from those wounds, from the fear, that the environment that he grew up. It's so messed up. And just to scale down on his own child, that's so big. It just impacts me so deeply. And what you do today, how you do differently, is again, it's another few steps higher up. And your children most definitely will do a lot better than you, a lot better than their and that's what we hope for. That's what we hope for.
Oh, well, what a good person you are to be upset for me like that.
Oh, breaks my heart. That's why I do the work I do, because no child, including your father, including his father, should ever suffer in their childhood, because then they continue that, then they pass that trauma, that legacy onto the next generation.
Right.
And that's what I want to stop. That's what makes me going. And I'm very passionate about this. It's not about learning a new alternative tool. It's not about tools at all. It's about healing. It's about a much deeper stuff than learning alternatives to punishments. And I can teach you tricks and tools. You know, you can put it in your toolbox. But unless you heal your own trauma, you can never reach to your toolbox and use them successfully. It won't be complete.
There's a concept in psychology called the imago, and it sounds like it's a bit of a tangent, but I don't think that it is. And the idea about the imago is that we have this like internal representation of what a romantic partnership is supposed to look like. And a lot of times, if we grew up with parents who treated us in harmful ways, that the people that we are attracted to tend to be people who we weren't aware that they were going to be like this when the relationship first started, but they end up being people who repeat those same traumas. And unless we become more conscious of the kinds of wounds that we're carrying around, we tend to repeat them with this idea that maybe we can fix it, but you can't roll back the clock. So it takes something a little more intentional.
Yes, I agree. We repeat the patterns so much because it's hurting us. It's our pain. It causes suffering. It calls our attention to heal, because I don't know who said that bliss is our baseline. We want to be without suffering, human beings. That's why we repeat those dynamics and those patterns in our romantic or other interactions, because that thing that is inside of us needs resolution. It needs our attention.
What a great conversation. How about that?
Yes, I agree. And I think this is a great place to wrap up our conversation.
Sure.
I want to thank you again for this lovely time that we had together. It's very meaningful and special. And I hope our listeners will gain some new ideas, perspectives, and at least get the conversation going. Because when ideas become conversations and conversations become part of the larger conversation, change happens.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anna.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation that you just heard with myself and Miss Seewald as much as I enjoyed being a part of it. I wanted to remind you once again to take advantage of the No-Spank challenge. If you're interested, you can find that at www.parentingbeyondpurpose.com/NSC. Once again, that's free for you to participate at any level that you would like to. Or if you are not inclined to do that, but you know somebody who might be interested or could use the information from the No-Spank challenge, please pass on the website to them so that they can be a part of what's going on. I'd also like to just remind you out there that if you are in need of some parenting help or even some informal counseling, I'm available for you. I'm interested in helping those of you out there who just need a little bit of advice or support or want to run some ideas by me. I can be reached at info@drjohnrich.com. Thanks for tuning in. Talk to you next week.
Living in a city, when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are thought, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never wanna be a new IPMNation.com